Welcome everyone to our webinar, New Approaches to Inclusion in Reinstallation. I'm Mindy Bisa. I'm a curator at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. My co-moderator, Ryan Dennis, is unfortunately not able to join us, but we will do our best to carry on without her. Our topic today feels timely as discussion about inclusion in our field impacts museums at so many levels. Today, we'll specifically address the ways inclusion impacts our art installations and reinstallations. Our speakers are working at various stages of this, from initial planning all the way to reflecting on recently completed projects. So without further ado, I will briefly introduce what the flow of the webinar will be for the next hour, and then I'm going to turn it over. Swarupa, Michelle, and Valerie will each in turn introduce themselves and a little bit about their projects. They'll each talk for about 10 minutes. That way, following their presentations, we'll have plenty of time for a question and answer. And I do also want to remind you that you can type in your questions at any point during the process of the webinar. At the end, I'll collect those questions and then send them out to the various panelists. So again, welcome everyone, and Swarupa, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mindy. My name is Swarupa Anila, and I'm Director of Interpretive Engagement at the Detroit Institute of Arts. I did want to thank Mindy and AAMC for inviting me to participate in this forum. Everyone has noticed this avalanche of discussions recently about diversity, inclusion, equity, and access from AAMD, pursuing studies, and this past year, AAM and AAMC almost simultaneously focusing the conferences on these topics. So I'm excited to participate and hear from my colleagues here, particularly as a non-curator, interested to hear about conversations about curatorial practice and inclusion. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about an installation that we're doing now, our Asian reinstallation project, in which we're engaging a process of co-creation. So before we get there, a little bit about the DIA. We're what's often referred to as an encyclopedic collection. We have objects from cultures around the world, times ancient to present, with a majority of the collection is, broadly speaking, European and American. The museum's mission the vision is to be a town square, welcoming to all. And the mission is to create experiences that help each visitor find personal meaning in art and with each other. Now, in order to do these things, to be welcoming and to help each visitor find personal meaning, we know that we need to know our audiences, people who come and those who don't. So interestingly, the DIA relies very heavily on specialized expertise and interpretation from my department, and also on visitor research and evaluation, and we team up and partner with our curatorial experts so that we can really look to find that sweet spot, the overlap between best understandings of the art and overlap that with our understanding of visitor needs and interests. We were asked to define what we mean by inclusion, and the DIA doesn't really have a formal definition, but the mission and vision really do seem to require inclusive work. Traditionally, the way that a lot of museums have thought of inclusion has suggested more means around access, around assimilation, and that relied more on dominant narratives, canonical meanings, and ways of thinking. But we need this shift in inclusive practice, and this, to me, is fundamentally based in issues of representation: who is shown and who is not, whose stories are told and not, and whose voices help shape the narratives and whose don't. So the really interesting part of this work becomes examining what knowledge systems we rely on and how to shift them. And inclusive interpretive practices, we think a lot about decentering, really moving away from the idea that the museum or any one of us in the museum, curator, educator, exhibit developer, any one of us is a single source of knowledge or truth or creative ideation. This process means looking at how people make meaning and how to recenter those meaning-making repertoires. So we're looking for ways to explore multiplicity and find not universal standardized stories or lean on a single knowledge system, but to aim for multiplicity. We're looking to understand or recognize collectivity, but that collectivity that's heterogeneous and dynamic. And to do that, we have developed a number of audience engagement and inclusion techniques over the years. We've relied on advisory panels on both reinstallation but exhibition projects. These are panels of interdisciplinary experts in a variety of fields or areas related to the art, or ideas expressed in exhibitions. And they advise the curatorial interpretive team in usually one-time meetings, several times in the project at more stages to understand their through points. We've used focus groups. The participants of focus groups are usually selected based on demographic profiles and identity affinities, and they're infrequent visitors to the museum usually, and they advise for about 3 hours, and the staff is around to hear their responses in terms of what resonates and what are points of dissonance. We've also used in-community consultations, and for these consultations, the team will go out, connect with someone in the community, with a community organization, or who has a network with people of particular demographics or interests, and that person selects participants for the consultation. The team goes to that community center or site and basically are in someone else's home, and they are comfortable to say whatever they wish to the team, and basically that's shifting a little bit of the control mechanism to people in our community. The last is community inclusive teams, and this is our most recent experiment with the Asian project. And to give you a little background on that, the DIA has undergone a big reinstallation in 2007 of the majority of our permanent collections, and we had shifted to a team-based approach to be visitor-centered, and that brought together people of different expertise at different stages of the process. In the earliest part of the reinstallation development, the early concept phase, we had large cross-museum teams, so people from curatorial, from interpretation, development, conservation, marketing. They're really looking at themes and ideas that were generated out of the art that could serve to help the organizing principles for the galleries. Then the teams would break up, and the curators and interpreters would move on with the rest of the development process. But this was the beginning of a process that would move us to a visitor-centered approach. But now in 2015, for 2017, we were beginning a new set of planning for permanent collection reinstallations, starting with the Asian collection. And so we were trying to reset our logistics to figure out how we would do this. And the plan was to revisit our process from 2007 and use some of the same processes. But it was also an opportunity to look at our current and future needs. And the most important is that the DIA's relationships to our communities is very different from what it was in 2007. In 2012, 3 counties in our area approved a homeowner's tax to support up to 70% of the museum's operating funds for 10 years while we raised our endowment. With that tax, we have agreements with the counties to do deep community engagement and have new relationships and expanded relationships with people in those communities. And then in 2015, the city of Detroit survived a bankruptcy through a grand bargain, and the DIA contributed $100 million to support city pension funds and to secure the collection for the museum. These two outside events really did create new obligations, but also new opportunities for relationships with the residents of our region. Another reason for thinking about inclusive practice was demographics. Analytics tell us that our communities are going to shift by 2045 and become a majority minority. And so because our permanent collection installations stay up for so long, it really was in our best interest to look to our future and audiences that we desire to come. So the most important reason to engage in inclusive practice is because American museums have long traditions of displaying objects of cultural significance and representing cultures through our art, but decontextualized and often not with the consultation of people who see themselves reflected in those collections. So we decided to try this community engaged work for the Asian permanent collections. Rather than creating a cross-disciplinary team of only museum staff, at the early concept phases, the project team was designed to reserve positions for community members. So people applied for positions on the team and they were selected on their self-identification as Asian or having relationships with Asian communities. And they worked with the curators and interpreters in those early phases to develop themes. As paid consultants, they were charged with learning the objects, discussing and exchanging perspectives that would generate a list of potential themes and ideas that would move into the next phases of the process with the museum staff. We divided the project to test these new methodologies. We started with our Japan collection, which opened this past November, and it's continuing and continued with the second phase for the rest of our Asian collections that will open in the coming November. We learned a lot. There's a lot of cautions and a lot of excitement that was generated out of this process, and I can talk more about that. But the premise, I just want to underscore the premise of this, that by engaging people in the development of the installations that would serve not just their communities, but the entire region, we were getting perspectives in the room that were different from the ones that we would have just generated unto ourselves or even with expert advisors. We still involve focus groups and our expert advisors, but layered in these voices in this process of developing the ideas that are going to situate in the galleries. The premise is really of co-creation, is that there's powerful potential in connecting art and people, individuals, and communities in the museum during the planning process. We think that it will underscore their investment and relationships with the museum that we hope to continue. And it is this exercise in being an art museum that's visitor-centered and also community engaged. Some of the challenges were how to listen and just listen. And we don't just do what people tell us to do. We try to find a core question and find multiple solutions. But it is a question of how much to accommodate, in what ways, and even to shift our thinking from the idea of accommodation to integration. And a big question is how to look at our collections and the way we present differently. Being really open to the idea that objects that are stars in our collection might not resonate with people whose heritage derives from those cultures represented, but objects that we don't see as that important might spark real inspiration. But also to sort of figure out how do we exploit everything that we have, all of our tools, all of our resource and energy to create these more inclusive processes and spaces that can serve more of our public. So I'll stop there. There are a lot of questions, I'm sure, so I'll just hang on, and I look forward to hearing Valerie and Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much. And now we'll move on to Michelle.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Michelle White. I'm the senior curator at the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas. I currently oversee the collection of modern and contemporary art. And so I sort of have two projects that are applicable to this conversation today. First, I was invited to talk, I believe, by Mindy and Ryan because of a recent project that I recently opened with the contemporary artist Mona Hatoum. She's a Palestinian London-based artist. And I worked with her in addition to presenting her sculptures and a survey exhibition of major works. We also had the opportunity to engage with the Surrealist Collection. So the Menil Collection is considered to have one of the greatest Surrealist collections in the world. It's a sort of treasure trove of remarkable works, and really the touchstone for so many artists, including Hatoum, who's very much interested in engaging with the language of Surrealism. So what we did is, in certain parts of the Surrealist gallery, we intervened by installing some of her works, say in conversation with well-known works by Marcel Duchamp, René Magritte, for example, to both highlight her approach to making and thinking about her interest in contemporary art, the female body, feminism, but to also just rethink the Surrealist collection, shift it up, allow us to see things differently. And that's really been a bedrock of so many projects here at the Menil, and it has a really wonderful history that derived beginning in the late 1960s when John and Dominique de Menil, the founders of the Menil Collection, in collaboration with the Rhode Island School of Design, did a project called Raid the Icebox with Andy Warhol. And this was a project that really sort of set the stage for artist interventions and institutional critique projects to come. So Andy Warhol, because of their invitation, goes down into the basement of the Rhode Island School of Design Museum and brings out, cabinets of 17th century French shoes and stacks of frames. And for Mrs. de Menil in particular, and her sort of thinking about this project, really believed that this was the type of artist project into a permanent collection gallery that could allow us to see things differently. She called it the artist eye. And we've really thought about that a lot in programming moving forward as we're thinking about the permanent collection. How can the artist eye offer a new way to see that our sort of curatorial art historical eye may not? So just in the past 11 years at the Menil, in addition to this project with Mona Hatoum, we've worked with artists like Luc Toymans, Robert Gober, and the activist collective Otabinga Jones and Associates to work with our collection, pull things out, create their own narratives and stories, and in our permanent collection galleries. And it's something we've really had a lot of fun with. Our audience, I think, really loves, and it allows us to pull out things that may otherwise not come out when we're sort of doing more art historical presentations. And I'll mention, this is also a project I'm working on moving forward, is I'm currently working with the Los Angeles-based artist Charles Ray on doing something similar, where he is using our collection and going to pull out a series of modern sculptures in our main galleries to use to sort of talk and think about his own philosophies and theories around sculpture. So it's something we're continuing to do, and again, it really allows us to think differently about our collection. So in addition to that, secondly, the Menil, unfortunately, the main museum in about 4 months has to close for 7 months, which is such a big deal for our community and those that love us, because we're redoing the floors. But when we reopen, we're reopening with entirely new installations of the permanent collection for an entire year. So for an entire year, we are not taking any loan-based exhibitions. We're only doing in-house exhibitions, curatorial projects, and reinstallations from our collection. And this has sort of yielded a lot of interesting challenges for us, and I don't have answers, so I'm hoping the conversation can get there, especially in regards to the conversation around inclusivity. Part of our challenge is that we are not an encyclopedic museum by any means. We're based from a private collection, which means the objects don't tell any sort of linear art historical narrative. We have sort of pockets and areas of strength. So within the modern and contemporary collection, we have about 3,000 objects. And here's my problem, is that within that collection, as I'm thinking about those galleries, the idea of representation is not there, that this collection was primarily formed with a white male artist. And while this initiative is really exciting for us to pull out the permanent collection, have conservation do new projects on works that have never been seen, I'm suddenly faced with the challenge of what those permanent collections look like when our collection is not representative of a sort of more inclusive community that both we want to serve and that we hope to sort of present as healthier art history. So to give you just a statistic, we only have about 200 objects within those 3,000 objects by women artists. So my challenge now is thinking about what the galleries look like, how I can pull out works that have never been shown. And my other challenge is, and it's interesting to follow the conversation about the really interesting programming happening in Detroit, is that the Manila is unique, that we don't have any interpretation. We don't have an education department. We don't have docents. We don't do chat labels. We don't have didactics. And this is really the sort of bedrock of sort of a unique philosophy we have about wanting the viewer to have their own intellectual relationship with a work of art. But it also makes our jobs as curators harder, and that those issues and conversations and narratives can really only take place through the relationships that we establish with the objects. And those are the types of questions and concerns that are really driving our strategy meetings about what a permanent collection galleries will look like given these parameters, and also just wanting to highlight some of the best works in our collection.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that gives us some things to think about, both with a temporary intervention as well as facing some issues of how do you overcome an existing collection and build on inclusion. So Valerie, it's up to you.
Well, I don't know if the answer to that is up to me. Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Cassell-Oliver. I am the Sidney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. I have been in this position for all of 3 months. And my biggest challenges is translating what I've done over the past 16, almost 17 years as senior curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum, which functions as a non-collecting Kunsthalle, into an encyclopedic institution who is very eager and committed to engaging audiences. So the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts is a state-supported, privately endowed institution. It was founded in 1936. It has a vast array of holdings that goes from the antiquities to the modern and the contemporary. And my job has simply been to come in. It was part of a strategic plan on behalf of the institution to begin to expand its own holdings of work by African American and African diasporic artists. In my mind, that expands it even further in terms of that conversation to all artists of color, quite honestly, and especially to women artists, if we are looking to find ways to expand the conversations around existing canons, then I think we have to do that very thoughtfully, and that means quite a bit of expansion on all sides. The museum is also has strong holdings in paintings, and of course from the 1945s to the present, those conversations around art also get expanded into other genres, and so I'm looking to also expand in those areas as well. So when we get around to talking about questions of inclusivity, this is an opportunity for me to come into the institution and not only bring in those genres that have happened post-1945, such as conceptual art practices and performance and the things of that nature, but to also, in bringing in those conversations, to include a vast array of artists working within those modes. So I'm getting to know the collection. It is in a very extensive collection. There are wonderful opportunities to sort of create intersections and intersectionalities with other departments here. It is a vastly different way of working than the way I did in Houston, in the sense that there is a full-on education department that takes on things from the label writing to, I mean, all facets of interpretation. Those are things that the curators may begin to generate, but that it becomes a whole machine in and of itself that moves beyond the curatorial. In terms of public programming, those are also areas in which there is some conversation, but that also happens on a different plane as well. So there are actions that happen beyond the exhibitions, the exhibition making, the collection, and then there are spaces in which, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. There are spaces in which the public programming will also stand alone. So there are many different ways of getting to points of inclusion, but my job is to reflect that in terms of the objects that are being collected into the institution, and in terms of the exhibitions. There are spaces in which the 20th and 21st galleries are within my purview, as well as the sculpture garden. And so that we're looking specifically at those, and the space where temporary exhibitions can be had to also expand and expound upon the works that we have in the collection, and the ideas and the directions we'd like to go. So with that, I can, it'll be short and sweet, and then hopefully that'll evoke some dialogue to take place.
Great. Thank you all. And for all of you watching, this is a wonderful time to type in your questions. But I do have one that I think can start the conversation. It's specifically geared, Sarupa, at your process. And the question relates to how much do you work with your curatorial department on all of this process with the consultants and the teams, and how heavily are they involved in that process?
That's a great question. There's nothing that happens without the curators. So at the outset, our curator we're partnered together, a curator and interpretive planner for most projects. And for this team, it was the curator, interpretive planner, an exhibition assistant, and then the community members who would make up the team. So for all of the meetings that would happen, there were meetings ahead to plan what would happen at the meeting with the consultants. And really the curators really kick off the entire process, meaning they, even before the concept teams start working together, the curators look at the collection and identify what we call A objects, things that have great stories, really important, need to be out somehow. But also catalog B objects and C objects, and usually it's an exercise in really focusing on those A objects and B objects. And the curators, this is the curatorial work. They spend a lot of time teaching everyone in the team about the objects so that everyone has some baseline about what's important about the object, its context, meaning, function. But then, you know, they're generating themes together. So, and it's a very discussion-based exercise. The curator is there. Interpreter, our interpretive planner, so our wonderful curator, Catherine Kasdorf, for the Asian collection, actually jumped in after all of these meetings had been had taken place with our previous curator, and jumped in full force. And the interpretive planners, Ali Jean and Melissa Tita, had developed the exercises for the structure of those meetings. So they came away with a lot of ideas. And then the curators and interpreters just work completely in arm in arm through the process with everyone else who joins. As Valerie was saying, there's a machine here. So our exhibition designers, our collections team, everyone is involved at different parts of the process. So I could keep going, but I just wanted to underscore that the team-based process centers on curatorial work and also interpretive planning, and in different parts of the process, the exhibition design and so on comes in.
Thank you. And along with this, I have another question that relates to that curatorial involvement when it's not just you. Valerie, do you have other curators that you're consulting with and working with at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, and how much is your efforts more museum-wide?
Yes, there are other curators who are here at the museum. There are all in all 14 curators in various capacities here, and it's a wonderful opportunity to work together. Again, I'm 3 months into my position here. I've already begun working quite seamlessly with the curator of American art at the museum, and so that's been very fruitful in terms of the types of projects that we would like to move forward in highlighting some overlaps between our departments. Also, the curator of African art, who is looking to move more into contemporary acquisitions. So we've been working together as well. There are many opportunities to highlight, again, since we're looking at inclusion, to highlight ways in which the museum has historically collected art, and the ways in which we are looking to bridge these various departments together beyond time, but also looking beyond geography, and really looking at more global approaches toward our collecting by artists who are artists of color or coming from various cultural backgrounds. So we try to foreground that it doesn't all contemporary art all happen in the contemporary art galleries, but they also happen in the African art galleries. They also happen in the Asian art galleries, so that there really is a widespread understanding of an arc of how artists work, that artists from Africa are not just relegated to traditional classical African sculpture, that there's a trajectory, same way with Asian artists and those departments and the like. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me too to also stitch together these histories that oftentimes I would have had to allude to at the Contemporary Arts Museum. I can actually foreground those histories really within the galleries of other parts of the museum. So that's very exciting.
Great, thank you. And then Michelle, for you, and then a little for Surupa as well. When you're working with artists, you know, your Artist's Eye project, and bringing those artists in to do interventions and how they engage with the collection, the question is a little bit about how to, or have you had to adjust your timelines and expectations when you're working with those external groups? So either an outside artist, Michelle, in your case, or Sarupa, after Michelle's done, maybe a little bit about how that community engagement or those members might change a timeline.
Well, I mean, if anyone's worked with a contemporary artist, I feel like every single project is entirely unique, and that timelines and planning and scheduling have to change according to whatever the parameters of the project. You know, as artists in London, and we have to sort of Skype every morning first thing, or we're not going to talk. Or you know, I've worked with Houston-based artists to engage with the collection. So every single project is entirely different. So it's a hard question to ask, other than we plan accordingly with anticipating more space and time needed working with an artist.
I would agree with Michelle that when we work with artists who are either commissioned to do a specific piece, or we're working with them to bring in a piece, we know that we need to be flexible, and our timelines change. And that certainly happened with our Japan reinstallation. And to Valerie's great point, we know from our own professional expertise, but also what our audiences, our community members are telling us, that they do want an integration of the traditional and the contemporary, really to convey more honestly how dynamic these cultures are. And so for a Japan installation, an artist's work was brought, a contemporary artist work was brought in, I think within the last 2 weeks of before installation. And so those are constant and interesting ways to keep us on our toes. In terms of community members, we really did sort of manage and control the schedule. And so their issues and challenges were informed the scheduling process as well. We're trying to keep up with the conversation, keep them involved, even as they're not part of the phases after the early concept. And so really planning for touch bases throughout the rest of the development process is a little bit challenging, but we're really trying to remain committed to showing them progress and iterating again. Also, here's what you said, here's what we did, and any thoughts, and to keep that momentum, because it really at that point is about relationship building in really authentic ways. So it's a different kind of challenge. We have a little bit more control over that, but we need to be flexible. That's learning.
Good. And this question relates, any of you can answer it. Sarupa, was really related to your presentation, and specifically with the question of, did any of the curators resist or challenge the inclusive model of bringing in community members? But I think we can all think about that institutionally. Have you faced any resistance to inclusive methods that you're introducing or being challenged to present forward with installations or acquisitions, or at whatever level you're doing that?
I think there's hesitation always. And as I mentioned, our curator at the time we started left, and we have our new curator, Catherine Castor, on board. And there was some resistance and discomfort, and it really does mean a change in thinking. And I think we can, these kinds of conversations, sort of letting people know it is challenging. You have to think differently. It might set you back on your heels a little bit to hear how people respond to your work in whatever ways. And so, that was a little, I think this is a really good conversation to have. At the same time, there are real challenges that become exciting. They're exciting opportunities. So the team looked at sort of new ways to think about the tea ceremony based on some of the things that the community members were saying. They were integrating whole things around samurai culture. So there are interesting ways that it puts us in uncomfortable places, but those are good. I feel like if we're too comfortable, we maybe aren't doing things right. So it's an interesting challenge. I won't dance around that. So.
Valerie, have you faced, I know that you've not been there a long time, but have you faced any kind of resistance? And especially when we're trying to think of breaking away from that canonical, safe, defined place, any kind of resistance or thoughts on that?
I'm going to double check my audio. Has it been all right? Okay, all right, I've gotten a note. I'm very new to the process. I will say there is a genuine excitement about my arrival and what the intentionality of the institution is. I don't think there will be a lot of resistance, at least not at first. We'll see what happens when those canons actually are pushed and stretched and questions are placed forward and ideas about reshaping the way things look in the institution, what kind of feedback is had from the internal community and from the general public. So we'll see, but this is a great opportunity to have conversations. There are many conversations like this that are happening both within and outside of our institutions. So I think it is a safe space for dialogue to take place. I'm very excited about that conversation because I have a lot of opinions about it. So we'll see. I mean, there's certainly an openness on all parts, myself included. So I'm here to learn as much as I am to impart what I have to bring to the table.
Michelle, did you want to speak to it? I know you're just making those observations that your collection comes from a particular viewpoint and then now moving forward with that.
Well, I mean, this is, I think, what's so important about this conversation we're having, and Valerie, what you're saying, that when we're dealing with objects, when we're dealing with decisions about how to hang and what to hang, and thinking about inclusivity as a part of that, there's still these limitations. But for me, I think moving forward, and you're talking about like ideas of resistance, what I feel like these reinstallations can do and have doing for this museum and even the conversations around it is taking place now with the acquisition committee. That this is about, okay, who don't we have in the collection, and bringing it out and having the opportunity to display things and not display things really allows a small group that's not the community and just a small group of trustees who are making the decisions about what works are coming into the collection and how we're spending money on those, really important. That in a way that like whatever we do with what we think community wants and engagement, in the end, the difficulties of building a collection with limited funds, really a reality to the situation. And I'm really excited to use this opportunity to help us move forward in an acquisition strategy that can build the collection in ways that can sort of solve these issues and problems.
Yeah, great. And to tag on to Michelle, to your comments, I believe you said earlier that you don't have an interpretation team and all of that. So do you feel that the best way to show inclusion is through the objects? Do you think about any other methods?
It's the only way, and it's the only way for us as the Minnow. And I know we represent the extreme in terms of this conversation, but I also know going to so many museums that in the end it's the objects that do the work, and it's about how the objects are displayed, and that can have the most impact in a way that no matter what you write on a label, there's limitations in that too, in terms of who's speaking and what information is being given. So yes, I've loved working at the Minnell because of how it's forced me to push my understanding and respect and admiration for how objects talking to each other in relationship to each other have to do that work.
Great. And Valerie, another question came in that is asking, do you have the opportunities to think a little bit with community responses and engagement, or either acquisitions or how you might display the work?
In terms of the general public's involvement?
Mm-hmm.
No. I mean, the process is at this juncture, and I don't see it changing, fairly hermetically sealed from the public. I mean, in terms of the acquisitions happens primarily internally with curatorial, and really at MIN here, we don't even have an acquisitions committee. So, but that being said, we do have opportunities to present objects not only to the trustees, but to the public when they come in. And that is a great opportunity for conversation to take place, for dialogues to be started. And so it is a state institution, and so there is a real desire to be reflective of the complexion of the community that we serve. So with that, I mean, there will certainly be feedback. It's a very different cry or mission, if you will, from life at the Contemporary Arts Museum, where we were very artist-centered and culturally driven and audience responsive, which is Bill Arning's statement. That is something that I'd like to try to translate in some capacity to what I do, but the responsivity is something that I take very, very seriously, because contemporary art is always that sort of 200, not even 200, 1,000-pound elephant in the room. And it's always the thing that people feel is the most elusive for general public. And that's something I'd like to change. So where it may not happen in the acquisition side of it, maybe that can happen, as Swarpa said, in terms of the interpretive elements of it, and where we could bring in artists, since artists are living artists, to really engage publics in that way.
Good. And
Sorry, Sarupa. I meant to say Sarupa.
I have an interesting question, I think, that turns a little bit of this a bit on its head. If inclusiveness has not historically been a guiding principle, is there a potential that our audiences will perceive it not just as a positive shift, but as a disruption to that tradition? Would anyone like to offer some thoughts on that?
But my question would be back at does inclusivity mean though what we're showing and how we're showing, or does it mean the sort of programs and interpretive strategies around objects that potentially make it easier to understand?
I think it can be either, and so you could answer that and the other if you wanted to.
Could you repeat the question, Mindy? I'm sorry. I lost you for a second.
Sure. I think the idea is, if inclusiveness has not historically been a guiding principle, might the potential be that this just feels like a disruption to the tradition more so than, this positive shift? And if go ahead.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think museums are under pressure to become more relevant. And I think that's the reality that we're all grappling with. How do we become relevant? If we're not relevant to our communities, how do we become relevant to our communities? And a lot of that has taken place within the education and public programming side of it, in terms of reaching out what programs and events. However, it gets people through the door, but what sustains their engagement with the institution? That has to happen on an object-based level. And so where it may feel in many ways awkward initially, it is the wave of the future. It is the face of the future. And to stand within this, within the walls of the institution from the inside and make those conversations very real, make them very authentic as one can be, to really make those true connections is what will make them endure, in my mind, and make this not feel an awkward proposition, but rather a real sea change within the institution.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think to only do programs is a bit compartmentalized. It shows that it's only part of one part of the museum, but we haven't exactly shown it in our galleries. It feels a little more important to reflect what we say and do with our art objects as well. Michelle or Sarupa, do you want to respond?
I just feel like it's our jobs, and it's long been our jobs in the traditional sense, to always surprise, affront, confuse, create spaces of contradiction and paradox. And I don't think we're doing our jobs right if we're not constantly thinking about how to do that for our audience. So I think anyone that would question that or want something safe and easy sort of goes against the ethos, certainly, of what we do and how we do it.
Yeah, great. And we have about 5 minutes or so left, and I could keep asking questions that have come in, but I did want to give a chance for the three of you to ask each other questions if you had something that you know might be a good addition to the conversation.
I would just echo what both Valerie and Michelle have just said about we have an imperative to do inclusive work, and it's a lot of people talk about a demographic response, but it's also a philosophical imperative to represent and to be inclusive, so that people who come in the door either see themselves reflected in the collections or can connect in whatever way. And it's not, it is a little, a lot of people land this in terms of the survival of a museum, but it goes beyond that. The museums participate in culture making in the ways that people build their own identities. And it is critical that we do this work at all levels. And the walls of the museum really do have to bounce around these issues, so that you do create those really challenging dynamic spaces Michelle was talking about. And I've just really appreciated this conversation. So no, I don't have a question yet. I'll probably email you, but I'm liking our direction. Thank you.
Great. Michelle or Valerie, any final thoughts?
I would just say that I would concur. This is a very important conversation to have now that we're having it. And I think the attendance to this session is also reflective of that. And so I hope that for all of those who have tuned in, will find it also their personal mission and their driving philosophy to make their institutions in ways that they can. I know that it is a community, and we all need one another to make this happen. But to really have a driving force to be very reflective of the community in ways that they can be. So sometimes that can happen within the institution, and sometimes it has to happen outside of it. But you know, if we all do our part, it makes our lives collectively easier. So I'm excited, and I'm really happy to participate in it.
Wonderful.
I think my final thoughts have to do with collection building, which I didn't think I'd go there, but you know, it's such an important part of the future of our museums and what we are going to show and how we're going to show it, and the sort of traditional model of acquisitions within a museum are sort of not based on this sort of new inclusive strategies. So how might we rethink ways of collection building that sort of espouse maybe more of the strategies of inclusivity that we're taking to exhibition making?
Well, I think that's another good topic for a future webinar, specifically on acquisitions and collection building for the future. I want to thank all three of you and the AAMC for setting this up, and just a note for everyone to please watch for the next webinars, and if anyone ever has any suggestions, I know AAMC is open to new topics or anything else that you would like to hear discussed at one of these or at the annual meeting. So if no one has any final thoughts, I'll just once again thanks everyone for tuning in, and thank you panelists, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.